welcome to our special coverage of the war in Ukraine. I'm Teniola Shoboale. First, the headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addresses the United Nations Security Council. Russia says Ukraine's special services staged alleged killing of civilians. Plus, EU outlines new sanctions against Russia. Once again, welcome. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed the UN Security Council. In a speech, President Zelensky outlined a list of alleged Russian atrocities, showing a gruesome video. He alleged civilians were shot in the streets, thrown into wells and crushed by tanks for the pleasure of Russian troops. Let's take a look at the developments today.
Ukraine's president addressed the United Nations Security Council, accusing Russia of genocide and asking the West for more military aid to fight the invasion. His address comes after evidence emerged from around Kiev suggesting mass civilian killings by Russian forces. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian forces are trying to hide the traces of their war crime and alleges that more than 300 people were tortured in Bucha, near Kiev. Russia has dismissed the allegation of war crime, calling it propaganda, and claims Ukraine staged civilian deaths.
We're having Russian PR Vasily Nebenzia.
Moscow is set to defend itself at the council, where it holds veto power, and has promised to present evidence that its forces were not involved.
We have factual evidence that proves this point. We intend to present it to Security Council as soon as possible, so that the international community is not misled by the false narrative promoted by Kiev and its Western sponsors.
European Commission President has set out proposals for new sanctions targeting Russia's economy. In a statement, she accused Moscow of waging a cruel and ruthless war and said its alleged atrocities in Ukraine cannot and will not be left unanswered.
We all saw the gruesome pictures from Bucha and other areas from which Russian troops have recently left. Yesterday, I conveyed to President Zelensky my condolences and assured him of the European Commission's full support in these terrible times. These atrocities cannot and will not be left unanswered. The 4 packages of sanctions have hit hard and limited the Kremlin's political and economic options. We're seeing tangible results, but clearly, in view of events, we need to increase our pressure further. So today we are proposing to take our sanctions a step further. We will make them broader and sharper so that they cut even deeper into the Russian economy. This 5th package has 6 pillars. First, we will impose an import ban on coal from Russia worth €4 billion per year. This will cut another important revenue source for Russia. Second, a full transaction ban on 4 key Russian banks, among them VTB, the 2nd largest Russian bank. These 4 banks, which we now totally cut off from the markets, represent 23% of market share in the Russian banking sector. This will further weaken Russia's financial system. Third, a ban on Russian vessels and Russian-operated vessels from accessing EU ports.
The US, EU and UK have together sanctioned more than 1,000 Russian individuals and businesses seen as being close to the Kremlin. Western nations have also frozen the assets of Russia's central bank.
Every cent what you receive from Russians.
The mayor of Kiev has urged European governments to cut off all business ties to Moscow, insisting that payments that continue to Russia are covered in blood.
Stop commercial communication with Russia, because every euro, every cent, what you receive from Russians or what you send to Russia have blood. It's bloody money. In the blood of this money is Ukrainian blood, blood of Ukrainian people. The Russians receive the money and they not invest the money to economy. They not invest the money to the population, they invest the money to the army.
Several European countries, including Germany, are dependent on Russian gas and are continuing to make large payments, money which Ukraine says is contributing to the war. Spain has become the latest EU nation to kick out Russian diplomats amid a global outcry over alleged civilian killings by the Kremlin troops in Ukraine. Madrid's decision to expel 25 diplomats and embassy staff follows similar moves by Germany, France, Italy, Sweden, and Denmark.
In the meantime, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says the killings in the Ukrainian town of Bucha were no random act of a rogue unit, but part of a deliberate Russian campaign to commit atrocities. He offered no evidence to support his assertion of a deliberate campaign, but before departing for a NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, he told reporters Washington backed Ukrainian efforts to investigate what happened. Bucha's deputy mayor said 50 of the dead residents found after Russian forces withdrew from the city late last week were the victims of extrajudicial killings.
As this Russian tide is receding from parts of Ukraine, the world is seeing the death and destruction left in its wake. And we're seeing, in particular, the horror that's been left behind in Bucha. Something that is touching people literally around the world. What we've seen in Bucha is not the random act of a rogue unit. It's a deliberate campaign to kill, to torture, to rape, to commit atrocities. The reports are more than credible. The evidence is there for the world to see. To make sure that one way or another, one day or another, there is accountability for those who committed these acts, for those who ordered them. There's also a strong determination to make sure that we're doing everything we can to continue to support Ukraine in its brave fight to push the Russian aggression out. And all of this together, we said before the aggression that we anticipated that if it went forward, there would be atrocities committed. Information that we've seen going into the aggression suggested that this would be part of the Russian campaign. Horrifically, tragically, what we're seeing in Bucha and in other places supports that.
Our Washington correspondent Maria Bird joins us now on the program for more. Maria, let's begin with the UN Security Council meeting in New York today. Speak to us about the key points in the address of the Ukrainian president. You know, this is coming after allegations of civilian killings in Bucha.
You know, this address, I think, was not more timely based off of, as you mentioned, the atrocities where whole families were killed. And so you saw Ukrainian President Zelensky outline and clearly depict those atrocities that occurred of whole families, of just kind of just a mass killing of what he almost referred to as a genocide. And so I think that was very much understood by the UN Council. I think that what they're going to be looking at now is how they can continue to support. Obviously, this means that there's additional weaponry and defense tools needed to be able to assist the Ukrainian people as they are fighting this war. And I think that really one of the key points to say, listen, we need all that we can from equipment to be able to defend ourselves. And so we know the U.S. has been very forthright and very much so a leader in the providing of resources, those defense resources for the Ukrainian people. And I think this is the question now, is that will it require more from the U.S. or will we be looking at more from Western leaders as well to be able to provide those resources to Ukraine?
The Biden administration is also seeking to expel Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. But what are other members saying, and how likely is this to happen?
You know, other members are beginning to be more vocal on this, and I think with what was shared by the president of Ukraine is going to definitely strike the hearts, but not only the hearts, but the minds of many of those leaders to say, maybe we do need to do more. And I think they will begin to follow along with what U.S. President Biden has said about ousting Russia, and I think if we begin to see continued atrocities such as what has been seen in the last few days, I think we could potentially see the ousting of that. And even more, what the president has asked for is for President Putin to be brought on trial for war crimes.
The Pentagon says it's obvious Russian forces are responsible for atrocities in Ukraine's Bucha. But have they provided proof to back up this statement?
You know, the U.S. government oftentimes will bring forth information and they will begin to then release the intelligence. As we know that these atrocities that occurred right out of Kiev and Bucha are ones that have been just recently, and I think the U.S. had speculation based on some of the intelligence information that would occur. And so we probably will begin to see over the coming days as to what the intelligence indicated, what kind of information they have. At this time, it's very likely that the U.S. providing strategic information and analysis to the Ukrainian people to ensure that the defense mechanisms and those resources that have been allocated are putting them in the best position to defend themselves as Russia moves in and continues, and if any further atrocities occur.
And President Biden on Monday reiterated, his accusation of Putin as a war criminal and called for a trial. And the White House says the U.S. is building a case for Russia war crimes. I know you've mentioned a few about that, but speak to us a bit more about that.
The U.S., as you said, they're building a case. I mean, this goes to kind of the earlier points around what does the U.S. have that is leading to them believing some of what the Ukrainian president has outlined. And this is all of the information that will be built on the case, and it's very likely that the U.S. president will bring that information to the UN Council and to those allies, NATO allies as well, to be able to build that case, to say, listen, this is why we must bring him up on trial. And so that information has been collected, I would say, for several months now. We know that the U.S. was one of the first countries to come out and state that Russia could potentially invade Ukraine and put out various sanctions or potential sanctions if they did, which we know have come into action at this time. So those cases will continue to be brought forth, and I think that we will probably see the U.S. being a lot more vocal, if not this week, probably definitely next week, about when President Putin will be brought up on trial.
And you mentioned sanctions there. What more sanctions are we expecting, and when are they likely to be announced?
Well, the U.S. bond sanctions, kind of a blocking on those, are going to be one of the very critical pieces. And we know that many of these bonds are in the process of potentially defaulting, which could then have a direct impact on the Russian economy even further. So many of the sanctions that we foresee are coming even further down the pike, and ones that were put in place previously, we're now beginning to see that the impacts of them will be much greater, I think, than they initially were set forth, and then expansion on some of those sanctions. And most of them are financial in nature. The U.S. president is looking at how can we address the economic challenges or create additional economic challenges for Russia, which then could put Russia in not the best position to be able to continue to invade and to bring forth a war against Ukraine.
All right then, Maria, thanks a lot for the update. And still speaking of sanctions, Germany's foreign minister says the country and partners, including the EU and France and Romania, will explore ways to reduce Moldova's exposure to Russia, the neighbor on which Europe's poorest country relies for energy supplies. Germany will extend a no-strings-attached €50 million loan to Moldova to help the country, Europe's poorest, deal with an influx of refugees from Ukraine and with high energy costs. Germany is hosting the conference in support of Moldova together with the Romanian and French foreign ministers. Moldova's prime minister will also take part in the conference. The country, with a population of under 3 million, has taken in more Ukrainian refugees per head than any other country.
All people have the right to decide their own future. No one should be at the mercy of their stronger neighbor, neither the people of Ukraine nor the people of Moldova. That's why we want to strengthen our cooperation with Moldova beyond immediate needs for the long term. Together with our Moldovan partners, we want to assess how we can help reduce Moldova's dependency on Russia economically, financially, and with view to energy needs, and to strengthen the country's resilience. And we will discuss how Moldova's economic resilience can be strengthened so that the government can undertake its planned reforms. To this end, and as a starting point as the chair for today's conference, we as Germany have made a unified financial loan of €50 million available to meet the financial needs of the Moldovan government.
And Georgia's former defense minister says that fighting in Ukraine is a battle for his own country too. Irakli Orishvili was among thousands of international volunteers in Ukraine. He says he traveled there to help defend the country from the Russian invasion that began on February the 24th. He has held several political positions in the South Caucasus Republic of Georgia, including defense minister from 2004 and 2006. Shortly after Russia launched its military offensive against Ukraine, Urishvili traveled to Kiev to help defend the country from advancing Russian troops.
We know each other more than 15, 17 years. Most of them, not most of them, all of them are former militaries from special forces, from engineer battalions, some of them are snipers, and we had a special motivation that we already passed this way what Ukraine is passing right now. We already faced the invasion of Russia in 2008, 2004, in the beginning of 90s, so we know that Ukraine is fighting not only for its own freedom, not only for its own independence and sovereignty. They are fighting for us as well, because if Ukraine will fail, then next will be the Georgia. I saw many nationals here, Brits, Americans, Polish, Estonians, many people, even Colombia guy I saw 3 days ago. Many people are acknowledging that if there is any freedom defender, any freedom fighter, their place is right now here. I'm just ordinary, regular soldier. In our team, we have former Ministry of Defense Special Force leader, and we are following and obeying his instructions and rules. And my status isn't just nothing here.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says Russia is not giving up on its offensive in Ukraine, but will try to refocus on completely taking the Donbas region in the coming weeks. Stoltenberg says NATO allies will be discussing the delivery of air defense systems and weapons to Ukraine at their meeting.
We now see a significant movement of troops away from Kiev to regroup, rearm and resupply, and they shift their focus to the east. In the coming weeks, we expect a further Russian push in the eastern and southern Ukraine, to try to take the entire Donbas and to create a land bridge to occupied Crimea. So this is a crucial phase of the war. Allies are determined to provide further support to Ukraine, including anti-tank weapons, air defense systems and other equipment. It's well known that we speak about advanced weapon systems. We speak about, for instance, javelins and other anti-tank weapons which have proven extremely effective on the battlefield. I have had close contact with the political leadership both in Sweden and Finland over the last months and also the last weeks. And I have conveyed the message that it's for them to decide, of course. But if they apply, I expect that 30 allies will welcome them, and that we will find ways to also address the concerns they may have about this interim period between they have applied and until the last ratification has taken place.
An Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has joined in the condemnation of the killing of civilians documented in the Ukrainian town of Bucha, but stopped short of accusing Russian forces of responsibility. Israel has been restrained in its criticism of Russia during the Ukraine crisis, citing Bennett's efforts to broker peace. Israel also wants to keep channels open to the Russian military in Syria, where it often mounts airstrikes on Iranian assets. The discovery of the slain civilians, many of them bound after the withdrawal of Russian forces from the town, has stirred a global outcry. Kyiv deemed them evidence of genocide. Moscow has denied responsibility and accused Ukraine of trying to smear it. Our security analyst David Otto joins us now on the program. David, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So what do you make of what we're seeing in Bucha? In your assessment, what do you think really happened? Is Russia behind this?
Tenure, I think, what is very clear is that, human rights abuses and war crimes are a clear byproduct, of a war of this nature. It's highly condemnable when civilians get the long end or the short end of the long stick, so to speak. But what one has to understand here, Tenula, is that there has been a huge investment in propaganda, in disinformation and misinformation in this war between Russia and Ukraine. So every evidence has to be investigated, and the right channels need to be followed through, and the process has to be an independent process in order to either ascertain any level of blame to Russia that, of course, has denied involvement in this, perpetration of war crimes, against Ukraine. Of course, Russia as well has, put out videos to show that Ukraine is also involved in alleged human rights abuses and war crimes. So this is something that has to be looked at very carefully. We know that in war, truth is the first casualty, and we have seen that propaganda again has been one of the most massive investment by both Ukraine allies and Russia in order to sway the perceptions of the population.
Well, considering all that, why has the West been so fast to jump on these allegations without concrete proof?
I think, it's very strategic, Tenula. You've got to understand that these accusations are used to influence the opinions and perceptions of people, of Western allies, of, the Western, backed, population, that, Russia is indeed an evil state, that Putin is, is carrying out war crimes, and this is used, to back the actions and reactions of the West. So for example, you would see that NATO has used this occasion to call for member states to, do more for Ukraine. And what you would quickly realize is that, they are proposing war solutions rather than solutions to end the crisis. So, for example, considerations have been made to supply Ukraine with more weapons. So perhaps this, could be one of the reasons why we're seeing this early, accusation. So I think it's important to know that this is, just to back up some of the sanctions that the West has levied on Russia, to back up, some of the isolationist policies that they've levied upon Russia. Again, it's a justification, as I rightly said, for military support. And I think, this is why you see these accusations being made early. But in my opinion, I think it's too early to point any fingers, without any proper and independent investigation.
Yeah, and to think that Russia also says it has evidence to show it's not behind this. I mean, how likely is the West to believe them? And if this is found to be true, could this undermine Ukraine in this war?
I think, first of all, it's difficult to believe any of them. It is not in Russia's position to try and convince the West that it is not involved. But I also think that it is not in Ukraine's position or the Western position to convince anyone that, Russia is involved. I think an independent investigation, perhaps by the United Nations, should be carried out. And the evidence of war crimes are always found in the timeline of events, so this is something which has to be carried out, not just in a matter of hours or days, as we've seen these conclusions being made, by the West that Russia is behind this attack. Remember that Russia has withdrawn its forces from Bucha, which is about 63 kilometers from the Kiev capital. And according to Russians' own version, they are saying that, this is a stage operation by Ukraine. But of course, Ukraine is also saying that, when Russia withdrew its forces from Bucha, it then carried out a massacre of civilians. But again, both sides, it's always, my side, your side. What we're waiting for now is the UN side. And, if we get that verdict, then, of course, we can move to, the position of apportioning blame as to which command or operational unit is responsible for this. But again, it's too early to make that decision.
Mm. And looking at, how fast the EU and also expecting the US to announce more sanctions on Russia, could these alleged atrocities be a tipping point in this war?
Yes, I mean, what we see now is an acceleration of, US and, of course, NATO's efforts to isolate Russia more, to then, again, apply more sanctions. Again, as I mentioned earlier on, for them to support Ukraine with more weapons. That, of course, is an escalation of the conflict. I remember that, Russia had promised to withdraw its forces away from Kiev. But what we see, the current narrative is that Russia is merely regrouping to then launch a massive attack, somewhere else. So, this is the narrative which is being pushed forward. But I think, this is not in the interest of the innocent people that have been killed, the innocent civilians that have been alleged to have been massacred. I think what we should be looking forward towards, or perhaps, be clamoring for, is a much more de-escalation actions and reactions, rather than, a position whereby we're tipping the war to a point where, possibly, could escalate further. And, people are already suffering enough worldwide. The price of oil, the price of gas is being impacted everywhere. So what one needs to see here is a de-escalation. But perhaps this is much more of a justification for the West to say to its population that, we are pressing more on Russia, we're pressuring them, because, of course, this war is impacting on you.
And on the issue of war crimes, how likely are Russian soldiers or even Putin himself to face a trial?
I think it depends on the level of investigation and who the arbiter of this investigation is going to be. The truth is that in every war, there are war crimes. So if you look very well, you would find evidence of war crimes committed by all parties involved. I believe that, the most, reliable or perhaps, capable organization that could, carry out these investigations is not going to be the ICC, because, of course, the United States is not even a signatory of the Rome Statute, and they are very much pushing for Putin to be taken to the ICC. So I doubt that the ICC will be the most credible entity. But I also doubt, taking into consideration the United Nations Security Council power of veto, which Russia has, that the UN will have any teeth, to launch any credible investigation with punitive measures. So it's a matter of the big boys fighting, no one to separate them.
Okay, let's look at the diplomatic front. With these latest developments, how optimistic are you of the talks that are ongoing? How optimistic are you that this could pave a way out of this crisis?
There are multiple fronts to these kind of wars. What happens in the military and the battlefield is one thing. What happens behind closed doors in terms of diplomacy and negotiation is another thing. But of course, what happens when you have these kind of accusations being made is it acts as a distraction to ongoing talks, which of course, was being or is being hosted by Turkish President Recep Erdogan. So I am hoping, as everyone else who is a lover of peace and stability globally, that these kind of accusations, do not derail the peace process. What one would be expecting now is to see that there is some kind of an appetite for Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainian president to sit down and have these talks. But again, I think Ukraine is having too much pressure, from the West in terms of the decisions that have been made. So it is very unlikely that Ukraine will take an independent decision in these talks if the West is insisting on pushing it to a different dimension. But I hope that we don't see any major impact. I would prefer that the peace talks go ahead and investigation of these war crimes are done separately.
Well, some analysts have said Russia is using the talks to buy more time so its forces can regroup. We heard there the NATO Secretary General also saying this. Do you agree with this, or do you think President Putin has realized it's time to scale down on his ambitions?
The truth is that you can never tell. I mean, when it comes to war, all sides, could take advantage of that, period of peace and, that ceasefire period. Calling for talks in order for them to rearm and regroup and re-strategize. This is not something that could be isolated to either Russia or Ukraine. This period of negotiations, when you call for talks, it's also an opportunity for you to reevaluate and re-strategize on, where you were going wrong and, where you're going right. There is a saying that, he who goes to the table must make sure that they go to this table, being the strongest. So I simply believe that, there is an opportunity for Russia to use peace talks to, regroup and rethink about its way forward. But also there is an opportunity for Ukraine to do the same. So it's just a matter of, what one's end goal is. But I hope that, these peace talks are real. And I want them to be real, because the impact of this war, again, is catastrophic, not just to Russia and Ukraine, but to the entire continent.
Yeah, and as the war continues, the side that is contemplating victory is not Russia, but Ukraine. Correct me if I'm wrong. But what are the implications of this? Will Russia be able to recover its image if it does lose this war?
I think the truth is that there is no winner or loser, when it comes to these kind of wars. I don't think Russia is going to win, and I don't think Ukraine is going to win either. We would see both sides losing tremendously in terms of, the bombardments that are happening in Ukraine. You've seen that. The casualties we're talking about. Remember, this war is hugely, largely fought, on the Ukrainian soil. We've seen a few incidents of Russia accusing Ukraine of launching missiles into Russian oil fields. But this is a one-sided battle. But the truth is that Russia is not going to win the battle because, of course, perhaps maybe that's not even his aim to win the war. Perhaps his aim is to make sure that Ukraine remains, very unstable to such an extent that it will be impossible for Ukraine to join NATO, which is Russia's own strategic aim, so it says. So I don't see any winners here. What I see here is two sides that are losing. One, Russia is losing its economy, it's losing its physical progress in the world because of the amount of money that is spending on this war. But in the same vein, Ukraine is also losing hugely. So there are no winners, as far as this war is concerned.
And David, what's next for Russia itself, especially for President Putin? Is it getting more or less likely that the people in Russia will overthrow Mr. Putin or cause greater civil unrest the longer the conflict lasts?
Every war that lasts long, has the ability to destabilize a nation. And I'm sure that what Vladimir Putin would try to avoid is to drag this war for long. Remember, the disintegration of the Soviet Union happened because of the long war that Russia decided to engage in Afghanistan in the 80s, with the United States. They were outspent, and that brought to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think Russia and Vladimir Putin will be very mindful of the fact that the longer the war drags on, the more destruction and instability that it will create. If you look at the sanctions which the United States and NATO members have levied upon Russia, I think the purpose of that is simply to cause an outrage within the Russian population and eventually a situation and possibility whereby the people can rise against Vladimir Putin. So this is, an unsaid strategic aim that, Vladimir Putin is likely to face. But, one thing which is very clear is that Russia has kept its cards very close to its chest. The information is not really coming up. People don't know what the Russian opinions and perceptions are because, the media is highly restricted. But again, I think perhaps on the other side, a lot of Russians may be seeing Vladimir Putin as the savior of the old Soviet Union, a sovereignty that they had and power in the world. So it's very difficult to tell. But the more and the longer the war drags on, as it is, the most likely that Russia and Vladimir Putin will be in big trouble.
And David, for Europe, what more can the EU and NATO do to help protect and further integrate the so-called frontier states?
I think what more the EU and NATO states should do is to not continue to, go towards the war solution. And that war solution is to arm Ukraine further. I mean, the biggest error that, they could make, looking at the impact of the war on the economy of Europe, it's really, really bad. So I think, what Europe and NATO should be doing is not to prolong this war any further. Again, as I mentioned earlier on, the strategic aim is to frustrate Russia, to collapse their economy, but indirectly, it will also impact on Europe's economy. If Russia manages to succeed and survive for a very long time, then it will find a way to move on. And that is not what Europe wants. I think perhaps they're looking at a quick collapse. But Russia perhaps has allies that it would rely on, maybe in Africa, maybe in the East. China could come to his help. Other countries in the BRICS, could support Russia behind closed doors. So it's a very dangerous time. And the last thing we want is a war that could escalate into a nuclear war. And we never know what Putin can do because, these are very challenging times for Russia.
All right, then, security analyst David Otto, thank you so much for your thoughts and analysis on the program.
Thank you.
Now, Britain has urged G7 and NATO nations to ban Russian ships from their ports and agree a timetable to phase out oil and gas imports from Russia. Speaking in Poland ahead of a meeting of NATO and G7 countries later this week, British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss said she wanted the country's allies to go further in applying sanctions to Russia.
On Thursday, I will be urging our NATO and G7 partners to go further in sanctions by joining us in banning Russian ships from our ports, cracking down on more Russian banks, going after industries that are filling Putin's war chest, like gold, and agreeing a clear timetable to eliminate imports of Russian oil, coal and gas. We've all been shocked by the scenes from Bucha. These are appalling acts of the kind we thought we'd left in the 20th century. We will hold those responsible to account for what they've done, in particular the reports of rape and sexual assault. I want the OSCE to investigate so that the full reality is brought to light, and I know that Poland is already conducting its own investigations.
Swojej polityki zagranicznej I realizacji aspiracji zarówno europejskich, jak I euroatlantyckich.
So far, our sanctions have had a crippling impact on those who feed and fund Putin's war machine. This week, we will announce that we've frozen over $350 billion of Putin's war chest, making over 60% of the regime's $604 billion foreign currency reserves unavailable. Our coordinated sanctions are pushing the Russian economy back to the Soviet era. But we can and we must do more.
Russian President Vladimir Putin says possible nationalization of Russian assets abroad is a double-edged weapon, in comments suggesting that Russia was capable of responding in kind. It was speaking a day after Germany said its energy regulator would take control of Gazprom, a gas trading, storage and transmission business, which Russia's Gazprom said was exiting last Friday. Putin also says that Russia needs to keep a close eye on agriculture exports to what he calls unfriendly countries. And more on Bucha now. A rights group investigator says he has gathered evidence of potential war crimes in Bucha outside Kiev. The discovery of a mass grave and body shot at close range in the town, Ukrainian forces reclaimed from Russian troops, led to a global outcry over civilian killings as more graphic images of their deaths emerge. The International Criminal Court in The Hague defines war crimes as grave breaches of the post-World War II Geneva Conventions, which lay out humanitarian laws to be followed in wartime. Legal experts say attacking legitimate military targets where civilian casualties would be excessive also violates the convention.
So there was a body that was here, and I'm trying to look for any physical evidence as to how she was killed or where she was killed from. And what we're seeing on the ground here are a few casings from bullets. And in addition to that, a number of different hits on this steel sheeting, which looked like many of the rounds that were coming into this yard were coming from this direction. You can see here the perforation of the steel, indicating that their rounds were coming through this direction. In addition to that, this whole yard is obviously burned and destroyed, but you can also see the impacts from either small ammunition or from shrapnel. So right now we're just trying to sort of figure out what's here so we can add that to any additional witness testimony and physical evidence that we can collect from the scene going forward. I mean, I think what we've seen here is pretty strong indications that a number of willful killings or murders took place on the basis of the fact that we have a number of people who appear to have been killed with their hands bound behind their backs using plastic zip ties. And obviously that raises concerns about willful killings or murders, and done in the course of an armed conflict, which constitutes a war crime.
Now, Yulia Sarycheva had no idea where she was heading when she fled Dnipro in early March with her 3 sons after Russia invaded Ukraine and ended in what may seem an improbable refuge with a Russian couple in Prague. Sarycheva was among the millions who have fled Ukraine since Russia's invasion on February the 24th and now seek a temporary or new life in countries like the Czech Republic and other countries in the European Union's Eastern Wing.
This is a story from these refugees. It's same story like from a Jewish Germany family. And now I must do that because it's like part from my deeply mental story.
The drawings in a makeshift classroom in Greece tell the story of Ukraine children who escaped conflict, tanks, bombs, burning buildings and bodies on the ground. In a small apartment which now functions as a school and haven for dozens of young Ukrainians and their mothers who fled the invasion, psychologist and teacher Regina tries to heal their wounds through art therapy.
For 3 days and a week, this small apartment in the Greek capital functions as a school and a haven for dozens of young Ukrainians and their mothers who fled Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In one room, teenagers put their thoughts on paper.
First time when I saw them, they was scared a lot. Now they're not, because they in a safe place. They have, I think they have everything to feel comfortable.
Nasreddinova, who has been in Greece for 8 years since leaving Crimea and works at the school, which before the conflict was a Saturday school for Ukrainian children born in Greece to learn the Ukrainian language. The school is now struggling to cope with more than 40 refugee students run by volunteers and their own funds several days a week. Nasreddinova gathers the children in a circle on the floor to talk about their drawings. She describes how a sketch of a Ukrainian tank by a 13-year-old boy depicts his feelings to seek safety inside the tank.
Tank is big, tank is safe, and tank can carry you. It's tank. I'm in tank. I hide from everything. So it's about it. He's so open. If you what I see from him, but he's like small boy. He's 30 years old, but he's like 5 years in him open because he want to hide from all this situation. He want to sit in this tank, in Ukrainian tank, and don't see it, don't feel it, what he feel now.
Sometimes even she is overwhelmed by what she hears.
I hear about war when I was a child, and I thought we will never see that. When I hear all these stories, how people die from kids, how they saw bombs, everything. This a little bit broke me, to be honest, because every time after them I have my meeting with my psychologist, because for me it hurt too.
Besides drawing, the children of various ages also keep busy making crafts. 3 of the teachers at the school, including Yulia Maximova, a teacher from Odessa who is in Greece with a 10-year-old daughter, are also refugees.
It's very hard. My soul is broken, but I'm happy that I can help children. Little, but help.
Her husband stayed to volunteer with Ukraine's territorial defense forces.
I am strong. I must live for her. I must be happy. When happy mother, happy her child.
Since February, over 1.5 million children have fled Ukraine, which Russia calls a special operation in Europe's fastest-growing refugee crisis since World War II. A third of the 16,000 Ukrainian refugees in Greece are children.
And now the meeting of the United Nations Security Council is still ongoing in New York. Let's bring you some live pictures. Speaking now is the Russian ambassador to the UN Security Council, who has rejected accusations of war crimes by Russian troops in Bucha, calling it propaganda. Well, earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a virtual appearance. Well, it was the first time he's addressed the council since Russia invaded his country at the end of February. In a speech, President Zelensky outlined a list of alleged Russian atrocities, showing a gruesome video. He alleged civilians were shot in the streets, thrown into wells and crushed by tanks for the pleasure of Russian troops. Let's listen now to the UK's response to the speech by the Russian ambassador.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Before I switch to English, I would say a couple of lines in Russian. Мы уже привыкли к вранью, которое постоянно выливается нам на головы в зале Совета Безопасности. Товарищ Небензя удосужился процитировать интервью из ресурса, который называется «Медуза».
And that's the program today. Thank you so much for watching. We'll have more updates on the Russian invasion at the news at 8. Please stay with us.